Welcome to the Centurion 360 podcast with PR marketing and crisis management expert Michael Bilello.
And welcome to the Centurion 360 podcast on Twitter at Centurion 360. My personal Twitter handle is Bilello PR. You can also send us an email, info at centurion-strategies.com. Today's topic, why do startups fail? For those of us either running our own startup or working with startups or just a fan of reading about startups, business in general, why is it that when you delve into the statistics, when you look into the research, almost 90%, 9 out of 10 businesses fail? Why is that? Is it the wrong executive team? Is it not knowing who the customer is? Is it bad pricing? Is it a bad economy? What are the reasons for failure? And I think when you really look at the research and you begin to couple that with your personal experiences with your own startup and consulting startups and clients, you quickly find out that it's really about not respecting the capital in the company and not having a good plan, a good culture, a good operating model, a good methodology. And the lean startup is that methodology. It's an approach, I think, that every company, whether you're a startup or someone who's been operating for a decade or more, there are definitely applications here because it fosters a culture that everyone who's on board with the company runs in a lean manner. And when you run a lean company, it allows you to get through the peaks and the valleys. The peaks are the easy part, the valleys are not, and every peak obviously turns into a valley. The same happens to be true with business. It's never consistent. So you want to make sure you have a lean approach to your business and that your team has a lean culture or a lean mentality, also referred to as an owner's mentality. So Dr. Rebecca White is our guest to speak about that. Dr. Rebecca White is a professor of entrepreneurship. She's the James W. Walter Distinguished Chair of Entrepreneurship, as well as a Director of Entrepreneurship at the University of Tampa. What you're going to find out about Dr. White, as I already know, is that she is not your average professor by any means. Very passionate, very informative, a pleasure to speak with, very experienced, has run startups herself, is very involved and embedded in the startup community today. And let's not waste any time. Let's connect with Dr. Rebecca White. Hey, Dr. White, welcome to the Centurion 360 podcast. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time today. How are you?
I'm well, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'd love to have, it's always great to connect with you, and I'm happy to have you on specifically because one of the things that I think you're very interested in, you're very good about reminding students who pass through the halls of University of Tampa, specifically the Entrepreneurship Center, but then also entrepreneurs such as myself who sit on the board and assist with the program however we can, when we can, under your leadership. The lean startup. The lean startup seems to be something that you constantly remind everybody. Again, whether it's a student or a practicing entrepreneur, tell us where that comes from. Where does that interest come from, and what is a lean startup?
Well, lean startup, it's really nothing new, but it is the newest thing. You know how those things happen. The really valuable, long-standing principles of business continue to apply no matter what the latest thing is. And lean startup is really that. And at its roots, it's about understanding your opportunity at its fullest and really applying the scientific methodology to entrepreneurship. Now, most people that talk about lean startup don't think of it that way, but that's what it really is. It's about identifying your assumptions, all those assumptions that you make when you decide, hey, I've got an opportunity here. And most of us don't even think about what all those assumptions are. But if you identify them right up front and you approach them rather scientifically, then you're applying the lean startup method. And that's not maybe what people expect to hear, but that's what it is at its most basic form.
Yeah, well, the last thing you want to hear as an investor or a CEO of a company is that anybody's making any assumptions. Although we do know that is the reality. Sometimes we do assume things. And it's certainly, I think, entrepreneurs, because you're launching yourself into the unknown, so to speak, I like the way you remind us, though, that there are knowns. There are probably more knowns than we, and I don't mean to sound like Donald Rumsfeld, there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, there are unknown knowns. But no, that's the whole thing. It's sort of the unknown. But whenever you can dive in and make I think, take a scientific approach, identify what you're getting yourself into, and be a little bit more procedural about that, which, by the way, most entrepreneurs are horrible about. It definitely pays dividends. Now, one thing you always make me nervous when I'm around you, because I always want to be a good student. So last night, before I knew you were going to join us, I wanted to do some research. I did some preliminary research, nothing over the top, nothing that's going to impress you by any means. But I read a study last night that Inc. magazine covered. It was study by CB Insights, CB Insights being one of these companies that just turns out studies, Javelin being a similar company. And what they did was they conducted a post-mortem startup failure study. And this was sort of a conversation that's continued on since last year, when Rand Paul and other politicians said that 9 out of 10 startups fail. And if that's the case, then we have a serious problem. But when you look further into it, some of the numbers are a little gray. I'm not sure if they're counting functioning operational companies, at what stage those companies are, or is it just somebody who files an LLC and then never follows through? I don't know what they're counting specifically. If someone else does, please let us know. But what's interesting to me, and more so I think to what you talk about a lot, is the 5 reasons. So it's more of the reasoning behind failures, not so much these people failed. We want to know why. 5 reasons: not the right team, no market needed, or as you always say, know your customer. They ran out of cash. That's obviously tied into the lean startup. And then the other 2, which were actually at the bottom of the list, were competition and pricing, which to me is the most interesting, because those are the most strenuous to figure out. Who your competition is, planning for new competition, what size of the market do you currently have share on, how do you grow and control that share, but then also pricing. Pricing is always evolving. You're always being undercut. Those should be the most strenuous things that cause failure, not the right team, no market need, and ran out of cash. What are the top 3, do you think? How do those tie into a lean startup? How can entrepreneurs and startups kind of avoid being part of a post-mortem study?
Well, that's there's a lot of different issues in there that I can address. And let me start, if you don't mind, by just commenting on the data, because you're right. Data comes from a lot of different sources, and we all know you can manipulate data to say pretty much whatever you want. And so that's always one of the challenges with understanding the success rate of startups. Because when do you start counting, and how do you get some objective measures? So let me just start by saying we use numbers like 9 out of 10 and 8 out of 10 businesses fail, 7 out of 10. People use those pretty commonly. But the reality is a very high percentage of startups fail, whether we're, no matter how we're counting them. And our goal, and one of my goals as an educator, is to help nascent and prospective entrepreneurs and early stage entrepreneurs figure out how they can avoid being part of that statistic. So I think, that's an important thing to note. In terms of lean startup, I said scientific method. And, I started by saying all things old sometimes become new. The reality is, when I'm saying scientific methodology, I'm talking about it a little differently than you might originally think, because you're right. A lot of it is about, do you know your customer? Do you know what they really want? Do you know your competition? Do you know what they're doing out there? How can you find out this information? And I mentioned assumptions. Whenever you go into a startup, we all assume we wouldn't go into it if we didn't have some belief that we could make these things work. And if we didn't have some beliefs about the market, the most basic of assumptions. A lot of times entrepreneurs fail because they see a problem, and they see a part of the market, 1 or 2 people or a few people that have that problem, maybe even themselves. But when they get a little deeper into it, it's not a large enough market, or it's not an accessible market. So the market isn't meaningful. So the question is not really, is our market there? Is there competition there? Sometimes having competition is one of the best things that you can have, because one of the hardest kinds of businesses to start is a disruptive one, one that's nobody understands. You're going to have to totally educate the market. So what Lean Startup is really all about, Lean Startup says, conventional research, even conventional market research, it doesn't always apply to the startup. And what you want to do, the lean word comes from, what you want to do is you want to start your business by spending as little money and other resources. Your time, energy, and effort is going to have to go into it, but you want to minimize the impact on your spending. And the reality is you want to fail. If you're going to fail, and you will, you want to fail quickly so that you can make changes. So figure out what all those assumptions are in the key areas. And we use this thing called the business canvas that has like 9 different areas. And it includes things like competition and distribution and strategic partners and revenue, costs, which is all part of your pricing. And, it forces you to go in and say, these are my assumptions about my costs. Are they true? So what you're doing as a founder is you're going out and you're testing those assumptions. And pricing has to start with an understanding of your costs. Obviously, that's not the end price because we've got lots of other pricing models. But using pricing as one of the elements you mentioned as a challenge, it's got to start with costs, because you can't make up in volume what you lose in margin, right? I mean, that's a big problem. So, the reality is Lean Startup says these are 9 areas to look at. Look at each of those 9 areas and what are your assumptions there? And then write those assumptions down in some way. And there's all kinds of cool apps and things, but you can also use a big poster board, and you can say, put your assumptions up in little sticky notes. That's what a lot of people see and they associate with the Lean Startup. And you actually go out and you collect information and you test each one of your assumptions, and you look at it from a scientific perspective. You are trying to disprove your assumptions. And the reality is, what happens is we have a tendency, because we want to believe in our startups, we have a tendency to want to focus on the easy questions. And so we get all these check marks and we gain all this momentum. And the reality is it's the really hard questions that kill a business. So if you think about it in the trajectory form, you've got all these easy questions about getting started. Is there a customer? Yeah, I found 1 or 2 out there. Is there, even if you do a market survey and you do it statistically correctly, that doesn't tell you whether those people you surveyed are going to act. What really tells you is if you get out there and you talk to them. So you have to deal with the tough questions first, and you can't be a coward about it. That's where it's tough. That's where it takes a hero to be an entrepreneur, a really successful entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I think when you start off this way, if you start your business with a lean mindset, you also develop a lean culture. And a lean culture means that if you make it past the point and privilege of being able to hire someone, to create jobs, when you bring that person in, making sure that that person not only understands how you built your company, but respects the fact that this is the culture. Because a lot of times, especially in our industry, public relations, marketing, crisis management, which is dominated by 3 markets, New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, a lot of folks that come over are used to working with massive budgets. And the only way to know how to run a campaign or come up with something creative is to buy their way through it, spend their way through it. That's not a viable option for a lot of, lean agencies, if you will. But what's interesting to me is that it's not just something to where you say, I'm proud of being a lean startup. I'm proud of being a lean agency. It's become a necessity. It's become adapt or die. This is a culture shift. Why are we seeing this? Because we've been sort of shell-shocked by the Great Recession? Why are we seeing this?
Well, it's interesting. It's a great question. The lean startup, as we talk about it, I mean, it applies in any industry, as you pointed out, but it really came out of the software industry, software development industry. And if you look all the way back to the technology bubble and the late 1999s and late 1990s and early 2000s, we learned a lot from that, because those were the days of looking at your burn rates as how successful you were. And the reality is basic business principles continued to apply through all of that. It was the wild, wild west. Everybody had an idea for the internet, and so that was our beginnings of all of this. And then we went back to understanding, and these were companies that geared up to 90 employees overnight, and then a week later found themselves back down to 4 employees. And I worked with several companies during that time that were, they were doing that very thing. I mean, and I happened to be a technology startup, not during that time phrase, but during the more reasonable time frame later in the mid 2000s, early 2000s. But the reality is the technology sector has taught us a lot of this, because everybody saw the internet and technology as an opportunity, and rightfully so, but it's more of a tool, and it always has been. So we had to get our minds back around what we were really working on. And by looking at the businesses that succeeded and the ones that didn't, this methodology came out of it. And the 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, that period, this most recent recession, that has just reaffirmed. And lean startup, I think, has, it's reached its tipping point because of what's happened. But the real lessons started much, 15 or more, 20 years ago, when we were just really pushing technology at all costs. And, it's really basic, tried and true business principles, but it's packaged in such a way that it has meaning, I think, for everybody. Technology, service, whatever. So it's really powerful, and we've incorporated it in the classroom. And it doesn't mean we're getting rid of writing a business plan or any of that, but we're focusing on business modeling first. And this is what any investor is going to want to know. What's your business model? At the end of the day, how do you make money on this? And how do you know, like you pointed out earlier, how do you know that you are the right person? And that's an integral part of lean startup. The founder has to be the person, or the founding team, if it's 2 or 3 people, that gather this information and make the decisions about when to pivot. And that's the new language now. When an assumption is proven incorrect, then you pivot.
Interesting.
And so it's not, that's why we talk, failure is such a negative word to a lot of people, but the goal in lean startup is try to disprove your assumptions. Work hard at it. And that goes against everything that we as human beings are about. So it's hard, but when you can adopt that philosophy that failing on an assumption is not a bad thing, it's getting me closer to my goal, then you can maintain a more objective perspective on what you're doing. And at the end of the day, it's always about people. It's always about our ability to pivot and to remain standing when we get knocked down. Because as an entrepreneur, I'm sure you've had some of those moments, and you've learned to endure them.
Yeah,
learned what you're made of.
No business is consistent. I don't care what you do, and if your business is really consistent, I'd like to know, who you are and what exactly you're selling, because it's just I've never seen it before. I've seen some of the best ideas. In fact, my first client was an alternative payment processor during the Great Recession, right in those initial stages, 2007. This company had tremendous technology, a tremendous idea. Spent 1 year on a media tour with Deion Sanders, who was the brand ambassador, setting up meetings to have this company's payment process purchased by a large retailer, big box retailer. And the founders of the company, to our point, the people who are setting the tone, who are creating the culture, I now know what to look for because of that mistake. I know what failure is going to look like before it happens. And the telltale signs, not all the time, but when that first investor check clears, if the founders show up in new cars And, there's something's wrong. It's the wrong priorities. You should be, hiring people or paying off some of your debt. But yeah, it's definitely unique. It's a pressure cooker. And to your point, anybody who's listening to this, force your failures early on, because those are going to be the cheapest. They become far more costly. Yes,
exactly.
Far more costly. Now, you said pivoting. That's a interesting term. It's more of a buzzword that I've heard recently, especially hanging around in the center with you and the students. Tell me more about MVP as well as validated learning. Is that sort of the process that goes along?
Sure. Well, the minimum viable product, that's what we call our MVP. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to test your product as early as possible. And again, remember, this came from software development, technology, apps, mobile apps, but it applies to everything we do. Think about the way that you started your own business, which is more in the service side. You tested it probably for many years in small ways. But when you got into your business, it's not like you went out and hired 200 consultants to work with you, or even 5 or even 1, right? I mean, you tested this, if I'm not mistaken, probably out of your home with the support of your wife and any other friend, family, anybody else. So the idea is whatever you're creating, whether it's a product or a service or a software, whatever, it's you create a minimum viable product, and then you get in front of people that we call in Lean Startup early evangelists. And early evangelists are basically early evangelists. We put it all together and create a buzzword there, another buzzword. But the early evangelist is somebody who has a problem so great in your space that they're actually willing to buy your product even before it's finished and help you finish it. So think about your first client maybe. Maybe you had somebody who really had faith and trust in you, and they were willing to work with you before you were a proven concept. And then they helped you develop your methodology and your concept and what you do. I don't know that that's the case.
I think they thought I knew. I think they thought I knew what I was doing, and then when I got hired and the contract was signed, I quickly had to figure out exactly what I was doing.
Exactly.
So that was more of a baptism by fire, which seems to be the theme of my life. But I understand where you're coming from. I appreciate that.
So you create this product, and let's think about it from the perspective. I had a student in the other day, and he's developed a new software product for students. And he came to see me as his former professor. And I looked at it from the perspective of the professors. And I said, this will never, because it had to do with course assignments, getting onto the schedules of students. And I said, this will never work if the faculty members, if it's not easy and accessible for them. Because if it creates a whole new workload, they're not going to adopt it. And then we talked about who he was going to sell it to and how he was going to sell it. So then we talked about the IT departments at universities, and we talked about other things. But my point is, I sat there and I discussed with him, not just as his professor, his former professor, but as a potential user of his product. I discussed with him how I would like to see that product developed and how it would be usable for me. So he has already spent about $40,000 on a prototype because he had some family and friends' money. He had some developers from his home country, which is in Latin America. And so he created this prototype. He now has a prototype that I can use and can help him build. So it's kind of like crowd sourcing for your product. If you get, and Lean Startup wants you to get out in front of 50 people if you can, like me. 50 professors that are going to say to you all the things that are going to make this product work or not work before you go hire a developer to do the other $250,000 worth of work to build it out. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, makes
so
sense.
Get a minimum viable product that I can try. Let me put it into place. Ideally, if I will pay you for that, it's even better, because what does that tell you? I really want that product.
Right.
Right?
Right, yeah.
So if I'm willing to take it even before it's finished, just like we do all the Microsoft and the Apple products,
Right.
If I'm willing to take it before it's finished and help you finish it, that product has a real life. So you are validating your customers through getting a minimum viable product out there. You have to have an investment of a small amount to get a product out there, but you get it out there and you let your customers help you build it. I know of lots of examples of how this has worked way before Lean Startup ever started, but Lean Startup has identified it and put it into a simple step-by-step process so we can actually share it with students, and other entrepreneurs can read about it and learn about it.
No, and I can see how that's also beneficial in getting closer to your price. If you pay him for that.
Totally.
Because pricing is like playing Battleship, by the way. You kind of take one shot and you hear, did I sink your battleship, or is it okay? And you just keep, you're trying to gauge, or as we called in the Marine Corps, bracketing your fire and moving closer onto the target. That's really what pricing is. What's the customer going to pay? So to be able to start off like that gives you confidence. Number one, I have a customer, there is a need. Let me hone my product, but also let me work toward pricing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's at every element, because again, remember I told you about that 9-point canvas that we talk about. Each of those, you got assumptions about your pricing, you got assumptions about your customers and who they are, about your potential partners, about your revenues, costs, all those things. So you're testing all of that with your minimum viable product through your customer validation. And when you find out things aren't going the way you wanted, that's when you have a war room, basically. And I mean, we call it that. And you go into your war room with all your assumptions. You say, these are the things we've learned. And keep in mind, the founder has to be out there talking to customers. You can't delegate that. So as the founder, you go in with your trusted advisors or your team or both, and you say in the war room, and you say, okay, let's get real. What's working, what's not? Do we pivot or do we proceed? And sometimes you totally cut your losses and you walk away. More often than not, you're at a point where you can say, well, what if we just did this? What if we tweaked it a little bit? Or what if we made this change? And I don't know about you, but I know my business, we started out down one path. We ended up building something different, related but different, because the market told us that.
Yeah.
And that's what it's all about.
And you quickly find out as well that sometimes if you work in different industries, for instance, we work in sports and entertainment, then we also work with private and public companies, also some government work. And you're always going to gravitate toward what you enjoy doing more. But sometimes you find out that there is an aspect of the business, perhaps, or an industry or a sector, or perhaps even a client, maybe that you're not so keen on, but you quickly find out that this is where your business needs to go. And I think you need to be honest with yourself. I don't know if there's a book out there called The Delusional Entrepreneur, but there needs to be, and there's probably 50 chapters that we can write about people we know. They refuse to take self-assessments, and it's not easy. You have to let go of your ego. You've got to let go and not, as we say, smother your baby and accept the future and pivot when needed. Otherwise, you're going to fall. So this is what we call disruptive. This is a disruptive, even just your approach as a professor, which is what I've always been attracted to. What are your peers? What are your contemporaries? What does the dean think about this? Because this is not very traditional. This is not, well, let's take accounting. Let's talk about business law.
Right.
This is not. This is very much so a game changer. How has it been received not only in academia, but also by investors, those folks who have the money to get these companies going that are in their 60s and 70s? What do they think about this?
Investors love it. There are still some traditions that are required, but most investors, regardless of the age, love it, because what it is really answering the questions that they always ask, and that is, delving into, is there really a market there? And can you really deliver? And have you asked this question? And have you really explored that? So I think investors, no problem. I think the classic business frame of thought process is being totally disrupted. But, that's what I like to do anyway. I'm a disruptor, I'm a deviant in my world sometimes, but it's a positive deviance.
Yes.
Because we have a lot of success with our students. And so I don't mind to say that. But, entrepreneurship education has totally disrupted business schools for the last 15 years anyway, because business schools have taught, big corporation mentality, and business and entrepreneurship professors quite often tend to be entrepreneurs themselves, which is a good thing, or they have that mindset. And so we've been disrupting the way that things are done. I think there is a battle right now between the people that have been teaching entrepreneurship for quite a while and those that are willing to embrace things that are new. And I've been teaching it for quite a long time, but I'm also always willing to learn, because I'm the first one to say, I have so much to learn about everything that I do. So, and I've also been through a software startup, so I understand how this works. So there is kind of a battle going back and forth about what we teach and how much lean startup should be a part of what we teach. But, schools like Stanford, for example, have adopted it robustly with what they're doing. And, some of the more conservative schools, I think, will definitely get on board. That's what happened with entrepreneurship education in general. My philosophy is a lot of what we've been teaching is still important, but it needs to be reframed in many ways, and we need to learn the new language. I mean, that's like a software developer or any other professor who creates their notes 30 years ago and decides they're never going to change it. So, I think we're disrupting a lot of things, the way that we teach and the way that we evaluate our students' success, because that's the real issue. Are we evaluating them on their ability to give us back terminology and memorize things, or are we evaluating them on the craft that they're learning? And I firmly believe that entrepreneurship is a craft. It is as much an art as a science, and so we have to have innovative ways to get our students out of the building. I call it getting out of the building. That's what they call it in the lean startup. As an entrepreneur, you've got to get out of your office. You can't be in your office and not know what's going on. In the same way, our students can't sit in a classroom and know what it's like to be an entrepreneur and be prepared for entrepreneurship. So they got to get out of the classroom. That's my mantra. And we get them out very quickly. And then, I hold them accountable.
Yeah.
On a very high level, and I bring in people like you to evaluate them. And sometimes we get a tear or two shed. It can be painful, but it's like, do you want your children to learn tough lessons when the penalties are you giving them, or do you want them to go out into the world and learn them when they end up getting penalties in much more severe ways? So it's the same thing. Why not test them and challenge them while they're in school? Shed a few tears, get some frustration out, right. But they understand what they're in for. So
yeah, no, listen, it works, and I've seen and I've worked with, and I talked to a lot of the students who have graduated from your center, and you're doing a tremendous job. You just had a team, 2 teams actually, advance to the final round of or global round of the Clinton Global Initiative Holt Prize competition. The only yes. U.S. team. Tell us about that. That's exciting.
Oh, that is so exciting. We're so excited to get this platform to show people the wonderful students that we have at the University of Tampa. But yes, 60,000 teams competed worldwide. All the major schools in the U.S. I mean, I can name all the Ivy League schools, all the major technology schools, all competed, and our little University of Tampa was the only U.S. school included in the top 5. There's a 6th wild card, and so we actually had 2 teams out of the 60,000 that made it. And both of the teams, one team got first place in San Francisco competing against competing against Stanford and all the great schools out there. The other team competed in Boston and came in 2nd place. So they have a chance to get into the wild card rounds. And you can Google the Holt Prize and read a little bit more about it if you want to. And their team, the team that one's Athello, Athollo, and the other one is Bamboost, Bamboost. And you can find them on the internet and maybe support. They're both at Indiegogo. And I'm just giving a little pitch here, but anybody that could go to Indiegogo and support Bamboost in particular, we're trying to get them into the top 6 as well. And this will be, if we win this, and we know we're well on our way, this will be the first time that a U.S. school has won this in all 4 years that this has been done.
Wow.
Oxford has won it, McGill has won it, Cambridge has won it, big name schools, but it's the first time that a U.S. school will have won it. So
USA.
Yay!
That's hilarious. Well, yeah, and so these I hate calling them kids. I don't know why I keep saying that, but these students are super motivated. They're all in. They really embrace the concept of social entrepreneurship, meaning you start a business that solves a social problem.
But it is a for-profit.
For-profit, right.
That's the cool thing. They're for-profit businesses, but they have a social mission. What a cool thing.
Yeah, well, and that's what I wanted to get into just real quickly, because I think that people make they have their misconceptions of what social entrepreneurship is. I'll let you take it from there. They
Sure.
are profitable companies.
Yeah. Social entrepreneurship certainly can occur in a nonprofit entity, but our social entrepreneurship, the focus that we have and the focus that much of social entrepreneurship is about having a purpose that's as great as or greater than the goal of making money. But it is for profit. I mean, when you think about not-for-profit and for-profit, for-profit has a requirement to return to their shareholders and their investors, has a required, fiscal responsibility. And that fiscal responsibility really drives towards excellence. I mean, if you believe in capitalism, as many of us do in this country, that drives towards excellence. So this idea of a for-profit business that can also do good is so compelling, and so especially to this young generation. They love it.
Yeah.
And even the students that are not starting something they would call a social enterprise have visions of their ability to give back. I mean, this generation is really excited about that. And President Clinton and the Clinton Initiative, former President Clinton, saw this and actually just created this initiative, which is basically each year they identify a significant problem, from hunger to education to water needs, and then they put this out there to amazing young men and women from all over the world and say, come up with an enterprise solution for this. And how cool is that? It's the government, it's someone coming from the government world saying,
right.
Hey, business can solve these problems as well as, or maybe better than, the government. So how about that? That's pretty cool.
And these students are inheriting a lot of problems. And so just to be focused on just making money is not enough. And what we see happening in California, for those of us who do business in California, a lot of California's political problems, their infrastructure, their environmental problems are trickling down onto startups, small businesses. Businesses are having to pay to operate certain ways. And that's not acceptable, because you are now increasing the likelihood of these companies to actually fail. You can't add stress. You can't add other responsibilities outside of just operating the way they need to operate to be successful. So it's very constrictive. So I obviously commend, as you do, former President Clinton, and I wish more government would get out of the way and let young, bright, smart minds get in there, solve a problem, and create some jobs in the process. It's not a bad thing. I think we could solve a lot of energy problems, a lot of our ecological problems, transportation, all the things that really bother us, I think can be solved. And like you said, the byproduct could be solving a major social issue.
And what's so amazing about this whole process is the learning process. Watching these 8 or 10 young men and women and their growth. And we had many other students on campus compete for this, because we had a team last year that did really well, and because of that we were able to have our own on-campus competition. But it brought the issue this year was early childhood education in slum areas, basically, and poverty. And so it was a real opportunity for students from all the departments, education, technology, entrepreneurship, to come together and work on solving a problem. So it's really amazing, and I think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, you've done a tremendous job inspiring these students, preparing them, and obviously giving them an opportunity.
But
to
it's all them.
folks.
They work so hard.
Yeah, but they wouldn't have a place if I think you weren't the driving force behind the center, for sure. That you've started a startup in the university there essentially, and to see what you've done in the last 3 to 4 years is pretty tremendous. For these students to come out out of a cannon, they're on fire. They wanna succeed. Joining a startup, perhaps their own, that's what's needed. That energy level, that drive, that's what's needed. If I'm a startup, a lean startup, these are the folks that I want on my team. These are the folks that have the right mindset. And even then I would be a little intimidated, because there are certainly things that you fall into when you run your company, when you operate your company over, as I have, almost 10 years now. You start to fall into some things where it's not acceptable. It's not how you wanted to start. It's certainly not how you want to finish, but it just becomes acceptable to the business model. My point is this: if I'm a mid-level manager for a corporate 500 company and I receive one of your students, I've got to really know how to challenge this person, to keep them interested, to keep them engaged. More importantly, they want to solve problems. That's their nature. That's why I did not, full disclosure, do well in corporate America, because I'm a problem solver. And when you have to go to work every day and someone tells you, we can't solve that, we have no ability to solve that, we just have to work with it and work within it, that's okay for a short period of time, but it also leads to frustration, but that's also a great driving force to leave corporate America and go start your own thing. Are students coming back and sharing the same experience with you?
Absolutely. And, and I'm even feeling it. When we hire some young talents, sometimes I can just see it. I can see that they have less tolerance than maybe somebody my age to deal with the system. I never let the system get in my way, and I never become a victim of it. And they don't quite yet have the maturity for that. So they need to be out in environments where they can deal with that. And you're right. I mean, I think it's a challenge for all of us to think about how we motivate these millennials. They come to us sometimes with a little bit of, and people get frustrated with a little bit of the arrogance that they seem to come with. But they are coachable. It takes knowing how to do that. And it takes, we've taught them as parents, and I'm guilty, to expect a lot from the world. And but hopefully we've also instilled in them the belief that they have a responsibility to give a lot back. So it demands a lot of us, as you pointed out, to bring out the best in them. And, certainly not all of them are going, I know I hear good and bad things, and some of them are going to, but these bright and the best ones, and entrepreneurship is a great field to look for the best ones, because they are not, they're already coming with self-responsibility and a belief that if it's going to be, it's up to me, right? They believe that. So
yeah, well, I think it's a good mindset to have, and I certainly think that there's disruptive forces everywhere, and there are a lot of shifts and changes happening. So even though right now I think a lot of us are still very frustrated with a lot of things that are happening, things are slowly changing. And slow change is the worst thing, because you watch a movie about a startup and it's over in 2 hours, and they go from a piece of paper to whiteboards to and it's fantastic, and then you realize, wait a minute, I've got to do this for like 10-15 years. I'm not that patient. But that's what it comes down to. So I also think that you do keep them rooted in reality. They're not fantasy driven. Millennials get a really bad rap. I think I was generation X or Y or Z, whatever the heck they called us. But everyone gets a bad rap. We're all young kids who don't know anything, and
that's exactly, it's the perspective that you're looking from.
Yeah.
Right?
Why doesn't anybody talk anymore? Why is everybody texting? I'm way more efficient now that I don't have to answer my phone every time. It's great. I love it.
And I'll tell you, working with young people has kept me younger and able to see that. And I wouldn't trade it for anything, because they are pretty amazing. And we have, I'm blessed at UT because we've got an extremely diverse population from all over the world, all over the U.S. And those kids are so open to that, and they're open to inclusion, and they're open to working as a community. And that's pretty refreshing. that's pretty refreshing in today's world. We need that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep up the great work. We hope to have you back at some point to give us an update, perhaps before the fall semester. If you have time, maybe we could talk about something else disruptive in the world of entrepreneurs.
I'm sure we'll be doing something.
Yes. But thank you, Dr. White, so much. I really do appreciate you. I know the students appreciate you as well. And like I said, don't be comfortable with hearing no, and keep asking until you hear yes.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
No problem, Dr. White. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Centurion 360 podcast. Follow us on Twitter @Centurion360. Until the next episode.